All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Mary Price, and I'm the Events and Marketing Director at the Shingo Institute at Utah State University. Today, we are learning from one of our faculty fellows and Shingo Academy members, Jacob Raymer. Jake has worked with the Institute as a previous Director of Education and as a Shingo licensed affiliate. He was one of the people who developed the Shingo model and coined the term key behavioral indicators. He has helped many organizations improve their systems and create cultures of excellence. Earlier this month, Jake wrote an article which was published in our monthly newsletter and on our blog, and it talked about using key behavioral indicators for predictive success. You can read that article by visiting shingo.org/articles. Jake, thank you so much for being here. I'll turn the time over to you.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be part of these webinars. And this topic specifically is something that's close and dear to me. Talking about behaviors in organizations has always been kind of an interesting discussion of those who have it, those who don't, those who want to dabble in it. For these next 20, 30 minutes, I'm going to probably approach this with two lenses, both as a Shingo assessor and also as an executive of spending 7 years in the healthcare industry, running 10 hospitals or running the transformation of 10 hospitals in Michigan. So there's been a lot of, here's the theory, how do you apply it, within the organization? Back in 2006, as we assessed the Shingo framework, to assess organizations, we realized that there was a gap that organizations were kind of falling off, over time and weren't as sustainable as we had hoped they were. And so as we evaluate that, we realized, tools are great, results, you need to get them. But there was a behavioral component that we need to start looking at as assessors. And in 2006, we basically called it, we need to be looking at KBIs, key behavioral indicators, as we assess organizations along with the tools, the systems, and the results. And that term itself, has caused, excitement and confusion at the same point. So I'm going to, hopefully spend a little bit of time kind of clarifying some of that confusion and helping better understand what do we mean by KBIs. The first thing, and the reason for the poll question is, how many organizations are really using behavior in an effective or a meaningful way into the organizations. And recently, Leadership IQ came out with some interesting stats on organizations. They looked at about 500 organizations, and it was interesting, the 24%. Only 24% of organizations have detailed what specific behaviors are necessary to live their company values, which means 3/4 have not, or they haven't really detailed what are the behaviors are, and probably more importantly, what are they not in the organization. But the other thing I found interesting was the daily element, that companies that discuss their values or behaviors daily have a 37% higher employee engagement than companies who discuss them, annually on here. And we know this, through our, performance evaluations. When we have an annual performance evaluation, we kind of put it off, to the end of the year, and then we kind of make up stuff, to meet those needs. The same thing with organizations that look at behavior. Those who look at it on a daily basis, it's a different mindset than those who just kind of annually, readdress the values. And that's, I want to go deeper into, what does that daily look like and how do you do that? As we talk about behaviors, I like to put these into 3 key groups, just to kind of create some foundation here. Every organization has behavior. There's some elements of behavior, good behavior, bad behavior, behaviors that don't matter, but there are behaviors within organization. You have them. The key is, and I call these the bricks, because the bricks are, they're all sorts of colors, they're broken, there's whole bricks. We're not going to use all of them to build. What we want to do, the goal and opportunity, is to select key bricks that we want to use to build within our organization. These are key behaviors, and I'll talk more what makes a key behavior. but we want to select key behaviors or key bricks to help us build our foundation with. Eventually, we're going to want to measure a few of these. And I'm going to probably repeat this 2 or 3 times. Every time, we identify behavior, behavior should be measurable, but it doesn't mean we need to measure every behavior. You'll have very few KBIs. In fact, the difference between a key behavior and a key behavioral indicator is a key behavioral indicator is something we just said we're going to measure. Most organizations will have 80 to 90% of their behaviors being key behaviors, not KBIs, meaning we're not going to measure every behavior in there. At Munson Healthcare that I ran as the transformation chief transformation officer, we had a lot of key behaviors, but very few did we decide we need to put resources into measuring. Now, where I think some of the misstep of this came is in 2006 when we said, hey, we're going to be looking at KBIs as Shingo assessors. Everyone thought that, oh, these are all KBIs. Well, we were assessors. So we were looking at measuring behavior, looking at the frequency, the duration of it, the intensity of it. Our job was to measure behavior in organizations. And so we called them KBIs. But most organizations will fall in the key behavioral element. To kind of help create a pathway for those that really want to start getting, bringing behavior to life in their organization, there's kind of a success pathway that that we've discovered, that we've learned, that organizations that have done this really well do these 5 things. And there's kind of a ground zero to this. So the ground zero, if you were to follow the success path, is you have to start with having a conversation with your leadership team, with your management team. Why does behavior matter? Why are we looking at it? And until you get a full, the aha moment of, oh, I think behavior truly does matter, and we understand why it matters, then it's difficult to kind of continue down this path. So having that conversation is going to be key. And I'll talk more about that one in just a moment. But once you've decided, yeah, behavior matters, it's important, you now have to identify behavior, key behavior. You have to influence it. You have to integrate it into the organization. And for some of those behaviors, we're going to measure it. So looking at identifying, and I'll just throw 3 Ps on there. If you want to know what makes key behavior key, it is that it's connected to our performance. It helps us get us closer to our performance outcomes. It's connected to our purpose, and it's connected to principles. So often, again, misstep is that we just need principles to identify, key behavior. Well, Munson Healthcare, our purpose was just as important. And so our behaviors need to be purpose-driven, but they also had to get us to our performance as well. So that's really what makes up key behavior, is performance, purpose, and principle. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about that one because it seems to be oftentimes the biggest misstep. But then you get into influence. And unfortunately, in 20, 30 minutes, I'm not going to be able to kind of dive deeper into these, but we have to influence behavior. And some of the best ways to influence behavior, to reinforce it, is you have to challenge some of our current beliefs, our mindsets, and one of the strongest drivers in an organization is building our systems to reinforce those, which kind of leads into the integrate. Are we creating an experience, a behavioral experience in our systems to reinforce those behaviors? We often design our systems to get results, but we don't design them to get the experience we want them to have, the behavioral experience. So intentionality is everything in integrating, connecting our processes and addressing resistance. And finally, measure and maintain, things that we decided we're going to monitor it, we're going to maintain it, we're going to improve it. So this is kind of a success path, kind of looking at some key steps as you begin to look at bringing behavior into your organization. I want to go into identify behavior. I'm going to start actually with the why behavior matters first, and then I'll get into identifying. Here are some key reasons why behavior matters, and your teams will come up with different reasons, other reasons, additional reasons. But if I were to identify 4 key reasons of why behavior matters, it's if you're going to shift a culture, climate, you're going to be dabbling with behavior. You need to understand what is it that you're shifting. Behaviors are immediate indicators, which means we can observe them, we can adjust them, immediately today. So those immediate indicators allows us to increase our ability to adjust. The one I highlighted, which is really the premises behind, staying ahead of the curve. If you want to stay ahead of the competition, if you want to stay ahead of, your industry, those that do use behaviors as predictive indicators. They're predictions of, and so they look at the behavioral patterns, and it allows them to be more accurate in predicting, are we going to get our results or not? And you'll see why that's so important, within an organization in the adjustment, how fast we can adjust. And then how we get results matters. As a Shingo assessor, we could sense either fulfillment or frustration in how they got results. And it was very evident just by observing the behavior. Do you want a culture of workforce that feels fulfilled or frustrated in getting results? So how we get results matters in here. Now, let me kind of go into that third one just for a moment. Behavioral patterns create predictive outcomes. It's not new information, to say, hey, our leading indicators are things that we can look at on a daily basis. These are pattern behaviors. Our lagging are the patterned metrics, things that unfortunately we can only see, after a week or a month. The problem, with this is that when we just look at our pattern metrics, we can't respond until a week or a month into the game. World-class organizations respond at a faster rate. And that's what we want to bring to Munson Healthcare is, how do we respond? How do we adjust quicker, faster? Now, I was an executive in the middle of the pandemic, and it was essential that we could adjust and respond, daily in here. And without a focus on pattern behaviors, we wouldn't be able to survive this one because it allowed us to realign, modify, adjust, tweak daily when we start seeing patterns. Now, someone might say, well, you can't see patterns in a single day. Well, when I go and look at, for example, problem solving, and I go into the emergency department and I ask, so tell me, let's talk about problem solving. I can jump into radiology in the same day, within the same hour, talk about problem solving. I can jump over into pharmacy in the same hour and talk about problem solving. And immediately I'm starting to pick up behavioral patterns across the emergency room, the pharmacy, radiology, IC, the intensive care unit. All of these areas begin to help create a pattern of, hey, are we doing good? Are we doing bad? Are we not meeting the mark? And I'll give you a more specific example on this. In healthcare, we have, just like in manufacturing, key metrics, that we're looking at. I'm going to use healthcare because it's close and dear to me, and I've just come off a stint there. But we look at things like readmission rates and medication errors, injury from falls, hospital-acquired infections, and the list goes on. But what we also know is that if I look at a few key behaviors, things that I can see on a daily basis, like proper communication, communicating patient information during the shift exchange, responding promptly to alarms and alerts when medical equipment has failed, reporting mistakes immediately, near misses immediately, that I know that when we see that kind of behavior and it's patterned, that it becomes a predictive indicator of we're going to hit. We're going to increase or meet our goals around readmission rate, medical error, injuries from falls. That pattern behavior actually has a strong correlation. We designed it to look at these metrics, what behaviors correlate with them, and the reverse is true, which means if I see, shift exchanges that are not occurring, they're failing, they're not reporting the information they need to, they're not responding, to the alerts of the equipment, or they're not reporting near misses immediately, then I can also predict by the end of the week or the month, we're not going to hit our readmission rate goal in here. So this is what I'm talking about, where pattern behaviors become strong indicators of what our pattern metrics are going to be in the future. And organizations that have learned to look for these can predict and adjust and respond quicker, faster, realign faster. So that's the power. When we talk about staying ahead of the curve, that's what behavior brings to organizations, is more that immediate response. To be able to do this, and a lot of people kind of shake their heads and go, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, but you got to be able to have two key things in play. These systems, daily rounding, Go-See, and routine pulses within the organization are critical to be able to see those pattern behaviors. You won't see it in a cubicle. You won't see it in your office. Leaders, managers have to be out there observing those identified behaviors that are important to us. So if you're not planning on doing rounding, this is going to be very challenging. If you're not doing routine pulses, this is going to be challenging. The key to these is that it's routine. If you're not going to be routine with it, it just scares your people when you round. So having routineness is everything. Focusing on specific pattern behaviors, meaning we're going in there, we're looking for targeted behaviors that we've identified, recognizing positive behaviors, finding out why workarounds occur, but not weaponizing them or demonizing them. We want to understand, why do we see workarounds? And then finally, you have to see all shifts, all times, all areas, to be able to really understand what is the behavior that's occurring. Most would understand the daily rounding. Sometimes I have to explain a little bit of the routine pulse. These are small pulses that we do within an organization that kind of helps us measure behavior. And we had over 10,000 people at Munson Healthcare. I can tell you now, they had survey fatigue. And so you got to be really careful as you survey your people on these. Our simple surveys, were like 2 or 3 questions. If we really don't understand how we enable people, do we really value people? We had, 2 key questions that we could send out, to their phones, and they could answer. It took them 30 seconds or less to be able to answer these. Sometimes we did 2 or 3, 3 or 4 of these questions, but we never went over 5 questions because it was just overwhelming. But the power of this is that now we can have information that was anonymous from our front line that added to our rounding, our Go-See activity, that either confirmed it or didn't. I feel comfortable experimenting to improve my job function. At the beginning, that was like disagree. It was on the low end. But over time, after looking at this for 3 to 6 months and modifying and adjusting, we were able to move that score over, move the behavior over. So these pulse surveys are simple, quick, and anonymous, that allow us to begin to measure these. They can be very effective. They can also be dangerous if you have too many of them. So let me jump back to identifying key behaviors. The key here, again, as I mentioned, performance, purpose, and principles. And this is what makes the difference between good, better, and best behavior. Organizations that are just performance-based, they're good behaviors, but what happens when we bring purpose to life? What happens when we optimize those with principles? We're now talking about key behaviors within an organization. And just to give you some 2 pitfalls I see often with performance, when it's only performance, expect to see behaviors. We saw workarounds, firefighting, heroic efforts. Those are behaviors, but that's when we were just performance only. We weren't identifying what was the positive behavior we want to see behind them. The challenge with purpose is that we have multiple purposes. What purpose do we anchor to? We have an organizational purpose. We improve lives. We have a performance purpose. Why are we tracking what we want to track? And then we have our system purpose. The answer is, if I look at just organizational purpose, almost any good behavior will fit underneath that. But as I start narrowing it to a performance purpose and narrowing that to the system purpose, behavior becomes more finite, becomes more detailed, more specific. So looking at all 3 of these is key as you look at identifying key behaviors. Do they connect with our organizational performance and system purpose in here? Now, because of, just a lack of time here, I'm going to give you 4 steps. If you were to start out, how do you start with, organizational behavior in a meaningful way? One of the first things we did at Munson Healthcare is, and I know there's a lot, but our values were established. We didn't want to change our values, but we wanted to anchor them, make them meaningful, and optimize them based on principles. So we would describe accountability in terms of creating value, respecting every individual, assuring quality at the source, understand managed variation. We talked about them in a principle light. And so we spent a day just taking our values and anchoring them to what principles really help us understand teamwork, compassion, stewardship. First exercise, step 1. Now, if you're sitting in this webinar and you're not a leader, don't worry, because you can also do this to your systems. Looking at systems, you can do the same thing. You can anchor principles to your systems. Which ones help us expound on, optimize our systems? So kind of step 1 is anchoring these principles to make these meaningful to me and my organization, my area, my values, my systems. The problem is that most organizations fall short here. You have to continue, and this is the hard part. Here's the heavy lift, which is, what are the behaviors? Now, what does that mean? So now that I have these principles anchored to my values, what do those behaviors mean for senior leaders, for department leaders, for frontline leaders? This becomes now our playbook, our behaviors that we identified that we want to see. This itself is very dangerous in the sense that most organizations and leaders, they will now send this to everyone in their organization going, here are the behaviors. Step 3 is critical. Step 3, I would encourage leaders, ignore the rest of the behavior. Your year 1 is just focusing on you as leaders. In fact, of all these great behaviors we identified, what are the few that we want to focus on in the next 3 to 6 months? So at Munson Healthcare, these became our game-changing behaviors. Leaders coach to ensure goodness of intent and address disrespectful behavior. Leaders focus on failure of process systems, not criticizing individuals. Leaders round to understand. So these were our top 3 behaviors. Of all this list, those were our driving behaviors. The question is, what do we do with the rest of these? The rest of the behaviors begin to get embedded into our systems. So how do we look at problem solving? So now I can take these behaviors and go, okay, here's what it means for senior leaders. Here's what it means for managers. Here's what it means for the frontline caregivers. These behaviors we're going to reinforce through the systems and creating that experience to reinforce those behaviors. One of the pitfalls is just sending this out, emailing it, to everyone else and say, hey, act differently. You have to embed this into your systems to reinforce those behaviors. Now, when we started at Munson Healthcare, we were now our ability to transform the organization. We had a very clear understanding of the why, the organizational purpose, performance purpose, system purpose. We knew what we needed to achieve by the metrics. We knew how we needed to achieve them. So now we had all key elements that we could start moving forward with. The key here is that, and this is a pretty standard behavior, all staff reports, mistakes or near misses immediately. Most organizations have that behavior. The difference is that we could actually talk about this behavior in a little bit different light. It helps us reduce injuries from falls, performance-based. Better, it helps us improve lives, targets zero harm. And it's optimized because it helps us show respect, seek perfection, focus on process. So how we could talk about these behaviors were very different than just stating a behavior. And it also helps identify key behaviors. Just with our time, and I apologize, I want to share so much more. Just know this is why you can't copy behaviors. Evolution of the behavior, we started, this was the best behavior for us today. over time, as we deepened our understanding, we were able to improve the behavior, level up the behavior within the organization. And I can tell you, we didn't know what, level 4 behavior looked like, but we knew that we were constantly improving, evolving our behavior throughout the organization. I did want to, share or just give time for some questions. So I'm going to skip 3 slides to this one. But if you wanted to just start to practice, take a screenshot and identify, let's talk about a key behavior. What performance goal would benefit from positive pattern behavior? What's the why behind the behavior? How will we guide this ideal behavior? What principles do we need? And then to influence, we might need to change some beliefs. What beliefs need to be changed? What mindsets need to be embraced? What systems will reinforce it? And this way you can identify a single key behavior and go experiment with it on there. So in our short time, I want to say thank you. And what are there any questions?
We do have one question, Jake. Thanks so much for doing that, by the way. Our first question, they ask, how do you determine how many KBIs you need?
The slide I skipped was this one right here. When we select key behavioral indicators, here's my 1, 2, 3. Take a screenshot of this one. We're looking for where we're red first. In our performance metric, where we've been pattern red for over 3 months, that's our first question of the behavior we need to be looking at. 2, what consistent key behavior will have the biggest impact in achieving this performance goal? But 3 is my safety belt. What behavior will immediately put us in the red if we don't embrace it? So our phase 1 of behavior was really on that performance side. We want to look at behaviors that are directly tied, and we weren't red in every one of our metrics. We were red maybe in a few. And so we picked specific behaviors, 1 or 2, that we really want to instill into our rounding.
Great, thank you. Next question, how are behavioral cause and effect relationships discovered and validated?
Great question. First of all, you have to abandon direct cause and effect to say one behavior causes a performance outcome. You'll never find it. But there is a lot of correlation when you start observing behaviors. In fact, the other slide I didn't share was this one right here. Oh, let me go one more. Metrics usually have a 1-to-1 ratio of, if I want to measure something, I need to have a huddle and a visual board so we can talk about it. Behavior doesn't share that luxury. If I want to reinforce a behavior, it's almost always a 4-to-5 ratio to 1 ratio. Meaning if I have a KBI that's all staff report mistakes immediately, there's going to be multiple systems that I need to embed this behavior in. Here's 5. For us to get that behavior, we had to govern it, investigate it, discuss it, see it, and understand it, which means incident reporting systems, safety huddle and briefing, daily huddles, visual management, leader standard work. So that's why we pick very few KBIs, because multiple systems will reinforce behavior. So go back to the correlation. It is really difficult to say one behavior gets me one metric. It's multiple systems are reinforcing a behavior to get you that metric.
Great, thank you. Next question. How do you deal with the fact that different leaders are at different places in the evolution of their mindset?
Oh, that is so true across the board. I'll give you the quick numbers game as an executive. I just need 60% of my leaders on board. If I have 60% of my leaders on board, they get the other 40%. So I don't need 100% of people on board with this. It's usually the mob that brings the others, to the table. However, and I saw this was a mistake that I saw years ago. I was working for a government in another country, and they said, we want everyone at the level 3 behavior. And so basically they were saying, 1 to 5, let's pick an average number. And I said, well, hold on. What do you think that's going to drive? Because people that are at a level 4 behavior are going to backslide. They're going like, we can relax. Those who are at a 2 it was perfect for you because it allowed to challenge them. Those who were at a 3, their mindset was, you know what, just ride the ship, status quo. That's what they want. Level 1, it was impossible for them to get there. You have to appreciate where people are. And this is why leadership coaching is so critical. As we go through this, all of our leaders are going to be at different levels in this. And so helping guide them to get there. But don't make a universal metric. We want everyone here by this time. It does not happen.
Perfect. Okay, I think that's all that we have time for. So thank you so much, Shake. I appreciate it. Thanks to all those who attended. I will send out a copy of the recording, so be on the lookout for that. And we'll see you again next month. Thanks so much.
Yep.